hosting it. It's really exciting to see so many people out for this event and thinking about these issues in all kinds of varying and critical ways, which has been a big focus of my work, as I'll talk about for the last few years here on campus. Today, what I'd like to talk about and bring to the conversation is how affordable housing can be considered a sustainability issue, why it should be. I wanted to just get a quick show of hands of how many of you live or have tried to live in housing off campus here in Santa Cruz. Okay, so some of you may be familiar with the fact that Santa Cruz is in the midst of what's considered by planners in the city government as well as most residents to be a housing crisis. Here is just an image that shows, if you can see, this is a long list of around 240 cities, and Santa Cruz is down here at the bottom in terms of its rank in affordability. And a lot of times this is measured in terms of the degree to which people are spending more than 30% of their income on housing. And that would be considered a rent burden or a housing burden, depending on if you're renting or owning. And the spending more than 50% of your income on rent or housing is considered an extreme rent burden. And here in Santa Cruz, the housing wage needed to rent a fair market 2-bedroom apartment without spending more than 30% would be around $34 an hour. However, as many of you may know, the major sector of the economy is low income, and while there has been great growth in employment actually in the county, most growth in employment has been in the low wage sector, and the average wage is at around $10.50, actually not on this thing, it's $10.50 an hour. And this was something that was discussed a lot in a project that my colleague Steve McKay did last year called Working for Dignity, that some of you may be familiar with, a large survey of low-wage workers in Santa Cruz County. So the housing crisis is really generated by this disparity in housing price, rent price on the one hand, and income on the other, and this terrible mismatch that's going on. So we could say, well, this is a classic sociological problem. How does this have anything to do with sustainability? And I wanted to think about that with you today. So the projects I've been most involved in that brought me to this question, one is Critical Sustainabilities here in the UC, analyzing competing discourses of urban development in California. The other is a kind of sister project at NYU called Democratizing the Green City. And both of these projects were inspired in a large part by the growth and interest, I'm an urban sociologist, and the growth and interest in urban sustainability. Many of you may know that we're in an era of what's called planetary urbanization, sometimes referred to as the urban age, in which the majority of the world's population is now living in cities, and that's only expected to continue to increase over the course of the century. And people are focusing intensively, when they talk about sustainability, in general, in this talk about systemic approaches, thinking about urbanization, thinking about cities and regions and the role they play. Often people say they contribute around 40% to greenhouse gases, as well as the burden that they bear and how the communities that are moving into, often as climate refugees out of rural areas, into cities, as well as disparities within cities, are facing the threats of climate change and other kinds of environmental crises that are associated with climate change and other kinds of problems, including issues of the pollution of water and soil and air and other things that are also affecting cities in a huge way. So how is that affecting people in different ways across the class, income, race spectrum is something that has been a big concern for both of these projects. Coming to Santa Cruz has been really interesting for me because, and this is the Critical Sustainabilities homepage here, has been really interesting for me because there's such a focus in Santa Cruz. Ronnie hosted a conference last year on the novel Ecotopia. This is a region that has attracted people from around the country for decades, seeking an ecological lifestyle. Similarly, the region is lauded for its sustainability. Many cities, including our own, have won numerous awards globally for their sustainability. And yet, this is a region, not only Santa Cruz, of course, but San Francisco, increasingly Oakland, the Bay Area, that is the most unaffordable in the country. And so coming here as an urban sociologist, I kind of sense this kind of contradiction going on. And in addition, I sense that there were multiple uses of the term sustainability, which I think is a theme that TJ wants us to think about today. So one of the ideas of the project, and this is a multi-campus project between UC Davis, UC Santa Cruz, UC Berkeley, University of San Francisco, so mostly focused on Northern California region, has been to identify what are the multiple and competing discourses around sustainability, how do they sometimes come into competition or conflict, what are contradictions when certain forms of sustainability win out over others, okay? And so we've identified different sustainabilities, and I'm just going to turn here that you can't really see it so well, but there's kind of 4 and then a 5th that we think are really prevalent in our region. One of them is eco-oriented sustainability. So one of the questions is what is the quote environment that is valued, that people wish to sustain? The question, what is to be sustained, is a question that we ask of all of these different approaches to sustainability. So there are approaches that privilege non-human environments, and so we think of those as eco-oriented and often divide kind of human and non-human ecology. There are market-oriented sustainabilities that privilege the sustainability of an environment for capital to grow, often in relation to eco-oriented sustainability. There's justice-oriented sustainability that often privilege human social needs and often thought about in terms of environmental justice, so access to green space and open space, and just food systems and so forth. There are vernacular sustainabilities, which are often not considered sustainability, but are traditional approaches to living and working with nature that have been sustainable and sustained over generations. And then there is the kind of utopian sustainability that's often this imaginary that infuses so many of these, such as the ecotopian imaginary. And we see these kind of competitions as kind of problematizing, helping us to think about some of the conflicts that emerge in this famous formulation of sustainability, which is called the 3 E's. How many of you have heard of the 3 E's if you're in the sustainability program here? You maybe have read about this, but when the Brundtland Report, the United Nations Brundtland Report, was put out in the late 1980s, it promulgated this idea that in order to have sustainable societies, we have to have this balance between ecology, 1 E, or environment, economy, 2nd E, and 3rd, equity, okay? And then if we can find that magic balance, then in the middle of this Venn diagram, we would have a sustainable society and a sustainable future, and we need to work towards that. But what are some of the conflicts that arise? And many scholars have found that some E's are more successful than other E's, and that in fact economic sustainability often is privileged over environmental and equity-oriented sustainability. And in our region, we associate that with market-oriented sustainability. We have found that to be the case. Scholars refer to this often as a kind of, in terms of the one that drops out, as equity-deficient sustainability. This is a term that Julian Aguiman, who's a big scholar of just sustainability, is a book that he wrote, has argued exists. And we find that in our region that is also the case, that we have incredible innovation technologically in terms of social movements, in market-oriented sustainability associated with ecology and associated with often other forms of sustainability, but that equity has dropped out. And that's not for lack of all kinds of alternative social movements oriented around sustainability in our region, which have a long history as well. Okay, so we look at different sites regionally where these conflicts come to bear in the Bay Area, and this doesn't picture Santa Cruz, but Santa Cruz as well. We have a new entry as of last month on the Beach Flats Garden by Michelle Gloa, who's a member of our group. But one of the things that we found repeating in many of the cases, and this has been the work I've been doing now, is to kind of analyze what are the kind of sites where we see much of the conflict emerging in our famously sustainable region. And the sites often have to do with places where eco-city green building is considered to be most successful, okay? And this gets at what I think is also a crucial point, which is that I feel like the sustainability movement is going to have to confront a kind of a new politics, if you will. So while we embrace, I think in some ways Fossil Free UC strikes me as a traditional kind of sustainability or environmental movement that's taking on an entrenched industry that has traditionally been and continues to be opposed to many environmental goals, many communities are finding themselves up against, for instance, real estate developers or other kinds of development projects that espouse environmental and sustainable goals, espouse sustainable environmental and sustainable ideals. And so this new kind of politics of thinking about, well, what do we mean by green? What do we mean by sustainable? And for whom? Who is going to benefit from these developments? In addition to opposing explicitly anti-environmental hazards, how do we take on this much more kind of tricky politics of identifying what we mean by sustainability and what we don't mean? And so, for instance, these are just two examples that members of our group, in this case Elsa Ramos, who was an undergraduate here, who's from the Mission District, and here Rachel Brahinsky and Lindsay Dillon, who's soon to be on our faculty, focused on 16th and Mission BART, which is a transit-oriented development project, and another transit-oriented Inigo City development project in the Bayview, Hunters Point area of San Francisco, both of which are lauded and have won awards and plaudits for their sustainability. However, neither of which are associated with affordable housing, and as a result of which have faced enormous opposition from groups in these areas because they not only threaten to displace, but they are actually having the effect of raising rents, gentrifying, and displacing communities in the regions around these developments. So I could say more about each of these and other examples of this around the Bay Area, but I do want to just flag that there is this growing literature on this notion of environmental gentrification or ecological gentrification, and then in addition, a growing examination in urban sociology, in political ecology, in urban and regional planning on how do we break that relationship between greening, gentrification, and displacement, and how do we understand the complex unintended consequences of this kind of equity-deficient, market-oriented greening that has these effects. So I just wanted to quickly turn to one study that I thought laid it out quite clearly in kind of step-by-step kind of a fashion, and in terms of understanding the complex systems that city and regions represent. So when you implement a greening initiative, some of the effects that can be had. And this is research out of Northeastern University called Maintaining Diversity in Americans' Transit-Rich Neighborhoods. And so they find, and there are transit-oriented developments, which are kind of one of the major forms of sustainable urban development going on in the country today, that are going on all over the country, and I could show you a map. Many of them are in this kind of northeastern corridor, but they're all over, including in our region. So transit station is planned. That has the impact of increasing land values, insofar as affordable housing and regulations on land and property values are not a part of that proposition. And thus, rents and home values increase, which accelerates housing turnover, which means that the people who move in tend to have higher incomes, and neighborhood income rises, which means that the people who tend to drive cars, who tend to be higher income, move into these neighborhoods, which means that the people who are low income, who tend to use transit, move out and are displaced, which means that transit commuting fails to rise as expected, which means that transit-oriented development is actually associated with increased greenhouse gas emissions in many parts of this country today. And so they further look at the planning tools that could be implemented that might mitigate some of these unintended consequences, which really focus on housing market tools, really focus on what it means to, before you build the TOD, before you build any kind of sustainable amenity, to think about affordability. And I think the order is really important here too, to start with affordability, because if you do it after, the impact will already be felt, and there's research on this as well. So starting with acquisition funds, preservation of affordable rental housing, and new affordable housing production in order to prevent some of these effects. So that is one kind of contradiction that we're seeing, having to do with increased greenhouse gas emissions associated with equity-efficient TOD that doesn't include affordable housing. The other, of course, having to do, what are some of the other things we can imagine might happen if you're displacing low-income people, workers, students, all kinds of folks who can't afford to live in the city center, where all of these wonderful, dense, the term density is the key here also, dense transit-oriented developments are occurring, is that they move, right? They're displaced to the larger region, and this also generates sprawl and sprawl development. And we see this throughout the Bay Area. And here I'm just referencing a project by Karen Chappell from Berkeley, who's a part of our project, Regional Early Warning System for Displacement from last year, that looks at the tendency of people to be displaced to the peri-urban region where the housing prices are less extreme. And so we're seeing people moving out further and further into the margins, and we need to think about what the impacts are on multiple levels of that moving, that sort of spatial marginalization. My class last year, last quarter, and last year, Eco-Metropolis, has been looking at a lot of these kinds of dynamics in the region as well as in Santa Cruz. And I realize I may be out of time, so I'm going to try to talk really fast. But you have environmental health consequences of having to commute longer and longer distances, which disproportionately affect low-income and non-white people, who are the ones who are primarily being forced to move out to these areas, which of course are lacking in transit options, right? And so people are commuting longer and longer distances, which has an effect on, you know, their health as well as their family and their communities. People can't go to PTA meetings. People can't participate in civic life of their communities because they're commuting all the time. And we're seeing commuting times in these regions, like the Bay Area, surpassing 2 hours on average for low-income people. So in addition, we're seeing other kinds of environmental health impacts, environmental impacts that have to do with health, having to do with exhaust and having to do with greenhouse gas emissions, and then air quality. And something that I am interested in exploring more, and that I think our campus could have a lot to say about, is habitat loss. I know there's a big Puma project on our campus looking at the impact of sprawl and growth on habitats for endangered species like our own mountain lions. And so, you know, that could be another way of thinking about these effects. This is just an image here. Santa Cruz is famous for, in 1978, having passed Measure J, which is an urban growth boundary for the city of Santa Cruz. And right now, one of the groups that we're partnering with on our project is the County Planning Office, which is seeing that boundary being eroded because people are being pushed out beyond that urban growth boundary into unincorporated areas, but also areas outside of what's considered the urban services line in order to just find a place to be able to afford to live. And I could speak more about what are some of the factors in terms of planning and the political debate around housing in our own city and region that have also generated this problem. But I just wanted to say, in terms of effects, you might recognize Highway 17 in the morning as one of the effects of this. And so we're seeing the same phenomena, and I'm hoping next year, perhaps together with the Sustainability Office and partnering with the folks at Berkeley, to study the dynamics going on similarly in our own region, which is caught up on a larger scale in this dynamic that we're seeing in the Bay Area and in Northern California. And finally, this is part of this project now that called Give Me Shelter, that I'm doing in partnership with Steve McKay, who is my colleague in sociology and who did the Working for Dignity project together with his students. And so Eco-Metropolis students and Steve's students are working on this massive survey on the experience of the housing crisis, and also trying to link it to larger sustainability goals for our campus and our region, because of course the increase in student population of some 700 students, as well as other kinds of pressures on local housing markets, are things that we as a campus community are going to have to think about. And how does UC Santa Cruz contribute to this conversation about bringing equity and bringing affordable housing back into the sustainability discussion for our region? I think we have a great role to play. So thank you.